Hello and welcome to the review of Harpy's Flight by Megan Lindholm. Lindholm? Yes, Lindholm. There's a lot to unpick already in this review and I'm not going to. I'm going to start with the how beautiful is that cover. Not the first time I've owned this book with this cover. Wish I'd kept the one I had when I was a teenager, which was in excellent condition. This is an ex-library book. It's not great, but the artwork is quite spectacular. Wrong, but spectacular. Okay, Harpy's Flight begins with a woman scaling a cliff. It's shaly and desperate. She's all alone and she is driven by furious vengeance. She has no particular expectation of surviving. She is completely driven. She's completely in her own fury. It's a great beginning. As she climbs, we slowly learn eventually that her name is Kai. We learn that she's climbing towards a harpy's nest. And we find out by tiny little bubbles of information that pop up every now and then while she's climbing this shaly cliff with her toes and fingernails, that her vengeance is based on the fact that her husband and children have been slaughtered by harpies. Probably these specific harpies. Initially we're not sure, later we'll find out. When she gets to the top, we learn more about harpies. They're not animals, they're kind of sentient beings. They've got artwork, they've got beauty. There's a spectacularly enthralling scene about how she gets into the harpy's nest, she finds all these things, and then she eventually finds the eggs that are carefully packed in straw. I won't tell you the details in too much. She gets her vengeance. A male comes in and tries to protect his eggs but doesn't succeed. There's a lamp is turned over, everything burns. The female harpy comes for her, but while she's carried aloft, she stabs her and the two of them land at the bottom of the cliff. Great scene. Then we've got another scene. We're shown a picture of her coming back to the Romany, of which she kind of is a member of the gypsies and kind of not. She goes back to them for healing, and part of the healing they want her to follow the customs of the people to release the belongings of her lost loved ones and then carry on with life. But she isn't ready to finish mourning and she isn't ready to let them go. And she walks away from the gypsy encampment knowing she can't go back to them until she's ready to move on. Then we've got another story where sometime after this, we gather, she's already healed. She goes back to her husband's people. Her husband's people were not gypsies. Her husband's people were farmers, farming the land. Sven himself walked away with them, by the sound of it, without too much regret, to go on the road with her. He, as a wedding gift, he made her this spectacular wagon that she's still travelling in. It's carved and painted. It's nothing like this wagon on the back of the book, but it gives you the sensation. And he gave her 2 3-year-old gelding horses to pull it. Eventually healed, she goes back to her husband's family to let them know what happened, to grieve with them. They very much want to do this particular ceremony. It's a rite of releasing or something like that. She arrives late one night. She's given a chance to wash herself off, change her clothes, and then it's out into the main room for the rite with all the family present. She knows nothing about this rite, and she hasn't asked, and that's a bad thing. Her husband never really spoke much about the beliefs of his people, and they only visited once or twice when the children were born, so she doesn't know very much about them or their traditions. She does know that there's a certain amount of admiration for or even worship of harpies that happens, and she's repelled by it. Her husband never indulged in it. Her aim is to be kind, to participate in this rite, tell them a few pretty stories, lies for children about what happened. to their son, brother, cousin Sven and his children, doesn't work out that way. What Kai doesn't realize is that part of their right is to drink these cups, and I won't say much more about them. And what they do is they create a shared mind. It's not quite telepathy, it's not quite empathy, but as they go through the ritual, her head starts buzzing, and her knowledge and her memories are shared with all his family. She'd planned to tell them some of the bits and to leave it kind, but instead they got to see the slaughtered corpses of her husband and children when the Harpies were done with them, and they get to see that the Harpies did it. She thinks she's concealed what she did to the Harpies next. She's not sure. But this completely and utterly devastates his family, and out of sorrow, regret, and a few other things, Kai agrees to stay with the family until some special priesty guy comes to release the sorrowing. She deeply regrets that early on. She hates being a farmer. She wants to get back on the road. She wants to get into her wagon and leave, but she never quite does. Most of the family don't like her there. There's a couple of the guys do. And the grand old matriarch, Cora, really, really wants her there. She wants her to stay. So, at this point, a lot of the image of Kai that you get throughout this story as a strong, independent, unapologetically solitary person who is more than a little bit harsh in her individuality. She is in some ways relatable, but in many ways she's aloof and even cold for the reader, let alone for the people around her. But she's an intensely proud, private, admirable human being in many regards. In this way, she very much grates against many of her husband's family. They don't like her. They don't like her there, but she has agreed to stay. One of the few people she does like is the matriarch Cora. At no point does she ask what this rite of releasing is going to be. Now, how batshit is that? All of this problem has come about because she went into this first rite not knowing anything about it or what was going to happen or how it was going to go. And we gather that she stays with them for months, picking pumpkins, harvesting things in the swamp, and not once does she sit down with any of the people who are sympathetic to her and go, hey, going into the last rite knowing nothing, that didn't work too well, you'd better tell me something about what's going on. Big problem that I had with the story. Anyway, so that story is not told sequentially. Nothing in this book is sequential. And that is part of my bitterness about it the first time I read it, and why I've always remembered it as a marvelous story, because the reading experience is glorious. But I have doubts about it. And I don't notice those doubts mostly while I'm reading, but as soon as you put it down, you start going, hey, wait, that didn't make sense. And it's the timey-wimey stuff at the beginning that doesn't make sense. So the climbing the mountain part, great stuff. By the time she's going back to the Romany, hurt and in need of healing, timey-wimey is already happening. It feels like maybe the author wrote a couple of stories or a couple of approaches or a couple of drafts, and when she combined them, it was far from seamless. But it's hard to tell, because all of this isn't sequential. You learn this bit by bit. Small bubbles of memory come up in Kai's experience while she's on the trail, while she's making soup or tea by her wagon, while she's thinking about other things, because it's never sequential. I personally, when I first read this, and this time as well, I thought she must have been injured twice. I thought she must have gone back to the Romany after her husband was killed. She must have gone off on her vengeance about the Harpies and then gone back a second time. And then the things that happen with Sven's family, again, timey-wimey, it doesn't make sense. But most of these memories, most of this backdrop that happens, up to page 70, it's really, really confusing. And at this stage, she's already on the other story that happens within this novel. So here we've got a Kai who's on the road and has clearly been there for a while. She's not injured. She's been making her living freighting cargo from one place to another. She's been offered a quite exceptional amount of money to take a parcel of gemstones across the mountain. And it has to be a particular pass. And it's a pass that's already approaching winter. The snow is deep. Most people won't take that pass. And perhaps she wouldn't have taken this commission if she wasn't well acquainted with the trader who offered her the commission, and he offered her a spectacularly large amount of money to do it this way. He does explain why. So by now we've got the same Kai. If anything, she's a bit harsher, and she feels a lot older really than she should, I feel, because it sounds like she and Sven got together when she was really, really young, 17. I don't think that's particularly young in a pre-industrial farming community, but never mind, they claim it's very young. She and him were together for a number of years. They had a couple of small children. She had been on the road long enough to heal a broken something, dislocated arm completely before she goes back to his family. She spent months there. She left. She's traveling around. She must have traveled around for quite a bit on her own because she's got all these little memories of stories that bubble to the surface. So she feels a lot older, really, from inside the story, inside her head, than she's got any right to. She could easily be a woman in her mid to late 30s, but I don't think that that's actually possible. So that was a bit of a timey-wimey thing. Anyway, she's on this pass. She's travelling towards the Two Sisters Pass. It's winter. She can't stay in the last inn because it's run by an alien race that don't approve of her enslavement of the horses, whatever. And on this pass, one night she's attacked by a man who's trying to steal one of her horses. He's desperate. He's skinny. He's been living off the land. He's desperate to cross the path, and Key allows him to travel with her. It's hard sometimes not to be impatient with Key, or Kai, or however it's pronounced. Though the story ends up explaining a lot eventually, there's still plenty of time to be annoyed with her decisions. Her decision to stay with her husband's family and to never ask about this right when the last one worked out so badly, that kind of doesn't make sense. There's an excuse for it later. I won't spoiler it. It does kind of make sense, whatever. The fact that she accepts Vandian to travel with her is more than slightly unreasonable. He attacked her. He tried to steal her horse. Her horses and her wagon are Key's life, and she is deeply bonded to them, and as we find out later, will leave any of them behind only on extreme pain of death. So it makes no sense that she'd accept that, and that Kai and Vandian never make sense to me. They never make sense as a couple. Again, while you're reading, every step is consistent. The fact that they travel across this path and she never asks anything about him, that builds into her incredible solitary character. But the fact that she tells him stuff about herself and he never reciprocates really in any way until far later, that doesn't make sense. You see wings tattooed on him apparently that look like harpies, and she knows she's being hunted by a harpy, and it makes no sense for her not to confront that. Later, he admits that he's gone through her stuff and he's found her gemstone cargo, which she had stashed in a secret panel, and she doesn't take issue with that. The things she doesn't take issue with are stunningly unbelievable. Anyway, by now, it's not a classic young adult romantasy or whatever they're calling them these days, where a bad relationship is clearly going to end up in the two of them together. This is an actual adult story written by an adult author with adult characters. The fact that they're not always consistent in their behavior is actually really quite adult and consistent with realities, but it isn't always satisfying when you think back on it. So Key and Vandian are crossing this path, And the two sisters are this haunted mountain pass where people have been found crushed to death. Vandian is scared of it. He knows it much better than Key. She's never travelled this way before. And it is indeed a haunted mountain, and bad things do indeed happen, and I'm not going to mention what they are. There's a happy ending, and anyone who goes online will find out what it is, and there has to be, because this is a book that, while all four novels can be read independently, it's part of a Windsingers series with 4 books, and includes the Limbreth Gate. Now, for all my whining about it, I love this book. The actual reading, page to page, of Key as she travels in her wagon and brews soup and hot tea in the snow. Her relationship with her 2 gelding horses, the wagon itself, the rich background, the tapestry that is this world is amazing. You've got alien species, including the Harpies, which are sentient, a couple of other ones that are completely different from humans. Every little bit is satisfying. You do kind of end up wanting more. I'm glad to know there are more books. I don't think I've ever read any of them. And the character of Key is wonderful, a wonderful, strong character. Which takes us back to the beginning. This is based on a story that in the 70s an editor chose for an anthology with female protagonists. Because in the 70s, the heroic fantasy was male dominated, and this anthology came out. The editor, Jessica Amanda Salmonson, chose a story called Bones of Dulath by Margaret Astrid Lindholm Ogden. Ogden was an American author who used to write under the byline of M. Lindholm. The author wanted to be clear that the editor wanted to be clear that her authors were female and writing strong female characters. And I've got to say, in terms of strong female characters, Key is one of the strongest out there. Not always the most relatable, but supremely strong, and maybe not quite heroic. She's such a flawed character, but her flaws are what make her an immensely formidable character. It's a formidable character in a lush, beautiful book. So since Salmonson wanted her authors to be clearly female, she contacted Lindholm and wanted her to expand on her name. Lindholm replied, according to Wikipedia, that she was not fond of her first name Margaret, but she didn't mind Megan. She preferred M, but Salmonson insisted on the Megan and credited her as Megan Lindholm. That story came out, and eventually Harpy's Flight was published by Ace Books in the 1980s. This is the Ace copy, I believe. And because the original Bones of Dulath had been published by Megan Lindholm, this one also was credited to Megan Lindholm. Apparently, the author was quite ambivalent about having her byline rearranged that way, but it happened. So there's that. The themes in this book include Key coming to terms with her grief for the loss of her family, but it's not mushy. She's not a mushy character. And the way her character develops and the way her companionship with Vandian develops is the way that she eventually chooses to move forward with her life. There's no deep emotional seeking. Everything is happening below the surface. It's far more about the adventures, and I've always loved that. So the sales of this book were apparently originally mediocre, and while there was a lot of critical praise for the characters, and how can I say, a lot of people weren't thrilled by it, and a lot of people, I think, didn't know what to make of it. And I will argue that the timey-wimey stuff in the first part is a lot to do with that. Because you don't ever really know where you are in the story, and you really can't tell how many times Key has been injured, and you really can't tell anything on a timeline that I think is what a lot of people take issue with. In terms of reading experience, I think this is a 5-star book because, well, all the complaints you can level against it happen after you stop reading. The actual reading experience from page to page is great. This is a 202-page book, and it took me days because it is lush, it's rich, it's beautiful. There's no moss gathered on this rolling stone. It's like everything is either deeply enjoyable to read or deeply meaningful to the story. And that's quite amazing because so many of the techniques that you'd normally see in a slowly developing relationship aren't there. They are individual characters and they have experiences, but the slow growth of a relationship between them is really slow. It's consistent with an injured, flawed, broken character of Kai. And Van Dien himself is broken in his own way. So yeah. I don't find it fast-paced and filled with action like some people claim. There is a lot of action, but it isn't fast-paced, it's measured. It feels like you're living it. I would thoroughly recommend Harpy's Flight. I really enjoyed Megan Lindholm's writing. Just brace yourself for the timey-wimey stuff at the beginning. And in terms of classic fantasy, I don't think your journey is complete until you've read it. I'm hanging on to this book for as long as it holds together, which might not be forever. I will doubtless read it again in a number of years. And even though I've read it a number of times, it somehow slips away from me and I forget the details. So each time when I read it, I can't tell if my expectation of things to come is foreshadowing that the author has done or it's a hidden memory. Anyway, I've raved enough about this book. It was a thoroughly good book. I do recommend it. Read good books.